Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. My guest today is Mr. Pete Forcelli, who's a former NYPD homicide detective. And today with Pete, we'll talk about the Diddy case, the case that involves rapper Diddy or P. Diddy, or also people my age remembers him better as Puff Daddy. That was the name he used to have in the 90s when his success was highest, I would say. Thanks for your time, Pete. Thanks for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
And I forgot to mention that we already know each other because we made an interview a few years ago about your 9/11 history because you're also a 9/11 rescuer. So I will add the link to that article to the description to this video so that people interested can go read it.
Yeah, it seems like just yesterday we spoke, and it was 7 years ago. My goodness.
It was 7 years ago. It was 2017. Yes, it was a long time ago. It's time flies. So, Pete, before we get into the PD discussion, would you like to tell us something about who you are? Because I think that it's also worth mentioning that after the NYPD, you also worked with the ATF, which is also a high-profile role. So, can you say something about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I spent 35 years in law enforcement in the United States. 15 of it was with the New York City Police Department. So I was a police officer in uniform there, then a detective, then a homicide detective. And then I went to ATF. I was an agent in New York City. In fact, I was an agent in New York City on 9/11, a supervisor in Phoenix. Then I went to our headquarters, which is a painful experience to go to headquarters, you can imagine. A lot of bureaucracy. Then I was in Miami, Canada, then back to headquarters, then Miami. I was the head of the ATF office in Miami during the Parkland shooting, where those school shooting where the 17 people were killed. Then back to headquarters, where I was the head of training for ATF, and I retired in October of 2021. So now I'm a retired guy.
Okay, making interviews and writing books.
Yes.
Okay, let's get to this topic we have to cover today. So this rapper, Sean Combs, who's also known by his stage name Diddy, was charged with something that you will explain us now, and he was arrested. So let's start from the basics. What was he charged with, and what does he mean, and what does it imply that he pleaded not guilty?
Well, in the United States, everybody has the right to plead not guilty and to be brought to trial, and the government would have to prove its case in front of a jury of 12 people who would have to either all determine and agree, yes, he's guilty, in which time would go to prison, or they might not agree, and it could be a hung jury, or they can decide that they find him not guilty, which doesn't really mean that he's not guilty. What it means is the government didn't prove its case. So, I mean, those are the three different outcomes that can happen. But he's charged with conspiracy and with, in essence, sex trafficking. In other words, he was using people for the purposes of sex. My understanding of the case, and I was not involved in the investigation, is that it's not that dissimilar from the allegations made against Jeffrey Epstein, which was that he was filming people having sexual intercourse with others and using the videos for the purposes of having people do things that he wanted. So in essence, the word blackmail would fit. But my understanding is that the case spans many, many years and that they've recovered evidence from places in New York, California, Miami, and knowing the U.S. Attorney's Office in Lower Manhattan, because I work with them extensively, they're very, very effective prosecutors. So I would say that Mr. Combs has an uphill battle ahead of him if he thinks he's going to beat the case. But again, the jury is the one that makes the decision in the end.
How strong is the evidence against him, as far as you know?
From what I've heard, and again, I'm not directly involved in the case, but the people who are working that case did interview me, which is, again, they're not telling me their case. They asked me a lot of questions about stuff that happened in the 1990s that I personally investigated. But it seems strong from what I've seen. And again, I'm not on the inside, so I don't have the intimate details, but just what's been reported in US media and from what I've heard from people who have knowledge of the case, it's a strong case. I mean, there's witnesses, there are people inside, and knowing how the Southern District of New York federal prosecutors work, they've probably already had other people who have come in who have probably pled guilty to things under sealed agreements that are cooperating to reduce their own sentences. I mean, that's from my experience working with them, how they operate. But they are the best U.S. Attorney's Office when it comes to just really making cases in the entire United States. In fact, they sometimes refer to them as the sovereign district of New York because they're feared within the Department of Justice as just being very aggressive and very thorough.
Well, events that he was charged with date back to the 90s. And as you said, all these events spanning a very long period. How come it took 30 years for these charges to be filled?
Well, the interesting thing is that in the United States, again, there's a presumption of innocence. I mean, you need evidence, and you need enough evidence for a prosecutor to feel confident that they could take a case to trial. Now, the investigation that I worked on that directly involved some of Mr. Holmes's associates was a murder. We had a lot of information, but never enough to actually make an arrest because we weren't sure that we would be able to take that case to trial. But when people are wealthy and powerful and surround themselves with violent people, a lot of time witnesses don't come forward because they're afraid. So what happens is if you can't get witnesses or develop other evidence, physical evidence, then oftentimes people remain unprosecuted. I've seen it happen many times, as a matter of fact.
So it's not that strange, even if the common people would think otherwise, because most of the people are not experts.
Yeah. And again, if people are afraid to testify against somebody, it's difficult to force them to get on the witness stand. And when there's a lack of other physical evidence, it makes it that much harder. But that's why all those search warrants were executed and a lot of physical evidence was recovered for what I'm told. And that includes cell phones, that includes videos in his houses. He had camera systems set up. Obviously, it's pretty well known now that he had thousands of bottles of lubricant, that he utilized for things that perhaps are a little X-rated. But my understanding is that there were also illicit substances that he used to obviously get these folks inebriated so that he could take advantage of the situation in the first place. So, but it'll be interesting to see as the case unfolds. But the Southern District doesn't move forward unless they have a strong case. That much I know from many, many years of experience with them. I would assume the case is probably very strong.
Well, what tell us about this criminal history? Because this is not the first time Diddy goes to jail.
Correct. He was actually not arrested, but he could have been arrested for an incident that happened back in the early 1990s where he held a concert at the City College of New York, where he was sued and he did lose. He determined that he didn't have the appropriate security there. And I believe it was about a dozen people were trampled to death. So, I mean, technically, he could have been charged with criminal negligent homicide back then. Times were a little bit different back then, but he also was arrested back in the 2000s for possession of a firearm. He was actually in the company of Jennifer Lopez, the famous singer and actress, and a bodyguard whose name was Anthony Jones. And ironically, Anthony Jones was one of the main targets of our investigation back in the 90s. But what happened was Mr. Jones took the weight, as we call it. He took the responsibility for the firearm and went to prison for it. So because he decided to take responsibility for the gun, the charges against Mr. Combs and Miss Lopez were dismissed and they were free to go. So, but yeah, he's had a very well established reputation of hanging out with some folks who had shady histories. So, but his criminal history itself is not very extensive. But the people he associated with had some very, very steep criminal histories.
Well, you mentioned that you have investigated a case involving his associates in the 90s, I think 95, if I remember well, that's what you said. What can you tell us about it?
Well, it was a weird case. It was a case where a guy, a young African American, was found disemboweled. His intestines were cut out in a stairwell in it's actually the largest housing development in the United States at the time. I think it might still be called Co-op City. And what happened was that individual's name was Keith Ralph. He had been released from prison. He was a drug dealer, which is why he was in prison, and he wanted his drug territory back. But what had happened is a new group of people had taken over that territory, which was very lucrative because Co-op City is kind of segregated from a lot of New York by the river, the Hutchinson River. So, I mean, people who want to buy drugs that live there, that it was a very lucrative market because it was very populated. So what happened was this person, Keith Ralph, wanted to take his territory back, but associates of Mr. Combs had taken it from him while he was in prison. So what happened was Mr. Ralph was called by Mr. Jones and another person. Mr. Jones, again, the guy who took the weight for the gun, and another person named Stephen Martinez, and lured to the stairwell where he was murdered. There were no witnesses in the stairwell, unfortunately. So we were unable to pin the murder on Mr. Jones, but we did eventually come up with an informant who told us the whole story, the whole scenario. And he told us how Mr. Jones was P. Diddy's bodyguard. There were some other people in his immediate club or clique that you would say. It included another rapper named Mary Blige, who was a close associate of theirs as well, and explained to us exactly what happened. But the district attorney's office in the Bronx didn't feel we had enough evidence to move on Mr. Jones, even though we had evidence with him and this guy, Stephen Martinez. So in the end, like some of the other cases, when we had no actual eyewitnesses, the case kind of died on the vine. But it was interesting as time progressed, things started to fall into place. For example, Mr. Jones said he didn't know Combs at the time. However, not too long after, as I just mentioned, he was arrested in the vehicle with Combs and Ms. Lopez and took the weight for that firearm. Much later, Mr. Jones, when he was released from prison for the gun charge, he was assassinated in a topless bar, a strip club in Atlanta, shot in the back of the head. So, I mean, a lot of the things that the informant had told us about Mr. Combs's associates started to fall into place, but unfortunately never enough to charge Combs with the murder or with the narcotics trafficking that happened that led to the murder. But for all I know, that might be something that the Southern District is looking at now. So I can't say whether or not that's part of the conspiracy, but with these conspiracies, they can go back as far as the conspiracy has been in existence. So if these are the same people he was dealing with in the mid 90s, the possibility is that that case could potentially be something they might charge in the future if they can prove that it was related to his ongoing narcotics trafficking.
Well, also has a longtime enemy by the name of Suge Knight, who was Tupac Shakur's producer. And Suge has been coming up and talking to the press recently, saying that probably one of the people harassed by Diddy recently is also Justin Bieber, and that would make a huge, as much as media exposure of the case. But can we trust him? Because, I mean, Suge Knight is not a saint. He's not an angel. He's someone who's in jail, and probably he was the orchestrator of the murder of the notorious B.I.G. in LA. Can we trust Suge Knight? How reliable are his declarations now?
I don't know. I mean, look, they were rivals. They had rival clubs. You had the East Coast rappers versus the West Coast rappers back then. But it's interesting that you bring that up because while we were investigating that murder, federal agents that were investigating the murder of Tupac Shakur actually came and met with us and sat down, and we tried to look at each other's evidence and see if there was any people in common that we might want to speak to. So, I mean, obviously these folks knew each other, and there was a severe rivalry back in the day. But look, some of the folks that Combs associated with were just as bad as Suge Knight and his colleagues. In fact, the person Anthony Jones I mentioned, when the FBI caught wind that we were looking at him, they called us and asked for a meeting. And it's kind of funny. He was a big guy. He's obviously Combs's bodyguard. And the FBI had warned us like that when their SWAT team went to arrest him previously on a narcotics trafficking charge, that he fought with the entire SWAT team and they had a hard time taking him into custody. So you're a pretty bad guy when you can get into a fist fight with a SWAT team and give them a run for their money. So yeah, both of these cliques hung out with some really bad people. But the interesting thing about Combs himself, if you talk to people, is he's kind of a nerd who lived vicariously through these really bad folks, where he himself didn't have the street credibility to do the things that these enforcers did for him.
Hip hop fan all my life, and I remember in the 90s that Puff Daddy, what that was his name back then, was actually playing the good guy in that rivalry because Tupac and Suge Knight were actually dressed as gangsters, while Diddy was always wearing a suit and a tie, and he also had gospel songs and prayers in his records, and he also had a song which is a cover of Public Enemy #1 by Public Enemy, in which what he says is, "Why do you guys hate me? I'm not doing anything wrong." Was he faking it? Was he faking playing the nice guy while actually he was as bad as his opponents?
Well, if you look at the things he's charged with now, he's obviously got some problems. But I mean, if they're true, he's not a nice guy. He's a horrible human being. Not as violent as these people were, per se. I think he had to surround himself with violence because he wasn't a tough guy. And what I do know is he went, a lot of these people, Tupac, Suge Knight, they came up from the streets. They didn't have anything. I know from my investigation that Combs went to a very affluent parochial school in Westchester County, New York, or Mount St. Michael. Very expensive, very high tuition. He had to wear a blazer to school, so he was actually, I guess you could consider affluent compared to some of these people. But I think that he wanted to be, he wanted to be a tough guy. He wasn't. So I think that caused him to associate with some really violent people. And obviously, I mean, if the things he's accused of doing with the sex trafficking are true, well, then perhaps a little bit of that might have been inspired by the people he hung out with. But clearly, he wasn't a person of clear moral character if you would do that to other human beings.
Well, but we mentioned that Suge Knight was probably the orchestrator of the murder of the notorious B.I.G., but we haven't mentioned that probably the orchestrator of Tupac's murder was Puff Daddy. So he was connected with gun violence. He has been connected with gun violence for like 30 years. What are your thoughts about now thinking what is going on and thinking that he had such a big role in the murder of Tupac Shakur?
Well, I don't know for sure he did. I know that there's a lot of people who believe he did. We heard rumors back in the day that he had actually coordinated with a person who's known on the street as Haitian Jack to try to kill Tupac. We were never able to prove that. I've heard it from other rappers. I've heard it from other people. Apparently, that was the word in those small circles of rappers who aren't necessarily very fond of cooperating with police. But I guess we'll see. And who knows where this case takes us? Because look, having worked cases with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, like I said, I know that they do a very, very thorough job, but they also tend to work with people who are in prison that cooperate and give up information, and they'll follow that evidence wherever it takes them. So, I mean, it could be other things that we hear about as this case unfolds that'll really shock folks. So I'm interested in seeing where it goes. And again, I'm a little bit humbled because our case was never taken to a successful conclusion because we couldn't get witnesses to cooperate and there was no physical evidence. So, it'll be interesting to see what these folks can prove that I couldn't have proved back in the 90s.
Of course, but how come, in your opinion, hip hop music is always connected with gun violence or with violence in general? Because we mentioned these cases, but there are many more, like Jam Master Jay, Scott LaRock, Big L. We could go on forever. How come? I mean, you don't find this kind of link to violence in other types of music. You never heard about electronic musicians shooting people around.
I think it's the culture itself of the music. It glamorizes sex, sometimes not in the most romantic ways. It glamorizes narcotics use. It glamorizes theft. It glamorizes violence, including gun violence. And to your point, like, look, back in the day, Frank Sinatra, right, who was a great crooner, was known to hang out with people who were affiliated with organized crime, but he himself didn't involve himself in criminal activity. With the hip hop community, not all of it, mind you, but with a lot of it, especially the gangster rap variety of the hip hop community, I think there's this need to prove yourself, to show I have street cred. So therefore, my music is believable. And I think that's actually a really bad thing because I think that some people who want to get famous by being rappers are doing things that they might not otherwise do, but to get famous.
They definitely don't set a good example.
Right.
What can we expect as an outcome of these charges against Diddy, in your opinion?
Well, like I said before, it's going to depend what the government can prove and what a jury believes. That's the other thing that's important to remember is juries sometimes are very sympathetic to celebrities, right? Like they think
Oh,
the
yeah.
government's only out to get them because that's a celebrity. It's happened with other celebrities in the past. So I mean, but again, Southern District does a good job of putting a case together, but all you need is one juror who's like, I don't believe these federal agents. And again, you need all 12 jurors to convict somebody. So it'll be interesting to see. But look, I think when it comes to taking advantage of women and people being sexually abused, if they have the evidence, if they have the videos, if they have the stuff that I believe they have, I don't think even the most skeptical juror is going to be able to put that aside and say, wow, the government's out to get him. Again, my understanding is there's a lot of video evidence and electronic evidence that is not sympathetic to Mr. Combs.
We'll see. We'll see. Well, Pete, many thanks for your time. I think that the explanations you gave us are from a very unique and informed angle. So I think that you clarified the whole topic for everyone who's watching this video.
Good to see you again, my friend. God bless.
Absolutely. Thanks everybody else for watching this, and see you all in my next episode. Bye bye.